Whether you choose to indulge in the wonders of outer space, either in reality or in fiction, there is no denying that it is a massive expanse with countless galaxies, solar systems, stars, and planets. So many different places where life could possibly arise and thrive. Or is there really for all? True, the fact that I stand before you speaking is an obvious yes, but what of the world where humans are still merely confined to their own planet as far as colonization goes? A different reality, so to speak? Suffice to say, though humans have only explored a tiny fraction of the universe in real life, they've observed so many worlds now that it's become increasingly clear that something feels off with the results that haven't come back from it all. While modern humans haven't been around all that long in the grand scope of the universe itself, they have been looking long enough and have recorded so much by now that it begs the question that seems to stand in the face of probability in more than one way. Why haven't they found any other intelligent life in the universe by now? Of course, some would say that they have, if the idea of aliens and flying saucers and other strange ships is a belief you hold dear, but in the realm of what is concretely known, it begs the question of why it is they can't find such life on their own, and what sort of implications could it have for the human race in the future? And even more so, if they are all that is out there, why is that the case? Today, we here at Science Team want to address this by looking towards one race in particular that may not just hold the truth of why intelligent life has escaped the discovery of their greater scientific community, but also shows what it may mean for their own species and their chance of survival in the long term. Today, we'll be looking into the history and presence of the Bryyo'mak, the original inhabitants of the planet Bryo, and the remnants of their race that the Hunter came into contact with during the events of the Phazon Crisis. So in order to really set the scene here for this analysis, we really have to address an elephant in the room that is vital in comparing the real world and the many worlds that exist within the universe of my crew and I, and that is the total lack of anything intelligent beyond the current reach of their own Earth. We sometimes take it for granted that science fiction introduces so many different types of life outside of our own world. Aliens have been a cornerstone for science fiction for about as long as the genre has ever really existed. But when we look at the real world, they got nothing. No aliens, no visitors, not even a real definitive trace of other civilizations or life of any sort out there. And yet, when you consider there are millions upon millions of galaxies out there, containing millions upon millions of stars and billions of planets, the chances of the right conditions for life arising are incredibly high, and by context, even if intelligent life is rare, it still has a very fair chance of arising on other worlds. So, where the hell is everyone for them? UFOs and conspiracies aside, by the number of options available and the immense size of the observable universe, let alone what may even be unobservable, you'd think that those humans would have found something by now, or that something had found them by now. And yet, here they are, far from radio silent, with nothing. This is the premise behind what is known as the Fermi paradox, the discrepancy between the number of potentially life-harboring planets that could host intelligent life, and the total lack of said intelligent life from what they have observed. It's a problem that has served as a prime barrier between the realm of reality and science fiction, and given that it's been around for over 70 years in their universe, many possible solutions to explain the paradox have been presented. What if it's an issue with the condition of their host star? Perhaps they're being quiet so more dangerous intelligent civilizations don't find and destroy them. For all they know, maybe they really are among them already and are staying out of the limelight in order to observe them like it's a frickin' zoo. There are many ways that the paradox can be explained, but of the many possible answers, there is one particular scenario that gives us the basis we need to start looking into the rise and fall of the Bryyo'mak as a point of comparison. The one solution I would like to bring to the forefront here is the Great Filter. In essence, the Great Filter dictates that there is one, or more likely several barriers or filters of a sort, that keep life from reaching a certain technological or evolutionary stage, like the state of the real human race currently exists in, and even further beyond where they currently are on their planet. These filters aren't exactly defined, since they could be any sort of situation or barrier, and we have no concrete way of defining them in turn, given our sample size consists of only us to measure it by, but this could range from something simple as the actual formation of DNA to create life as we know it, all the way to advances in technology that would make it possible for every given species to reach into the stars and travel, or even just see beyond the world from which their life arose. This on its own makes a lot of sense to me as the best possible solution that we can actually visualize, since humans have seen in their own world different moments in the evolution of life where these barriers have been reached and then broken through. Hell, the sort of complex multicellular life they are descended from possibly only arose partially due to disasters that otherwise would have killed life on the planet if an extremely rare and lucky set of environmental conditions had not occurred or otherwise had been present. With that said though, there is also a subset to this filter idea that I want to focus on here for this outlook on the human race and the Bryyo'mak, and that is a great filter of technology and society. And even more specifically, the notion that even intelligent civilizations may not reach a stage where they can actually explore beyond the reach of their own planet or solar system with life and not just technology like probes, because they would somehow destroy themselves before they could reach that level of technological advancement, or otherwise in connection with it. It's not exactly hot fresh news off the press that the human race has a tendency to attack and destroy not just the environment of their planet that helps sustain complex and intelligent life, but also each other, building weapons of war that can do untold amounts of harm to their own kind. And for anyone that lived through or even knows much about the Cold War, that sort of fear of self-annihilation was on the minds of just about any human that had a grasp of the sheer tension that kept the war from going away, even if weapons of mass destruction were never dropped on large populations of people. That time, more than any other so far in the history of their species, was honestly when they were closer to Armageddon than any other, and for that, it seems that they may have lucked out even more so, as that time did eventually pass. Though those weapons never went away, so I don't think we can safely say that they've entirely passed through that particular filter. There is a further aspect to all of this that the human race has experienced multiple times, and that is the rise and fall of empires and global societies in connection to events like what was just previously noted. The human race has gone through a hell of a lot in their brief time on their planet, and while evolution may have eventually brought them to a standing state where a higher order thinking became possible for them, it has not negated the primal and social instincts that have driven them into very dangerous directions in regards to the safety of their own kind. Wars have been fought that have devastated countless lives, and while very few of them could be seen as something that could have ended the human race as a whole, modern weapons and skirmishes hold promise of such a thing happening. Great conglomerations of power, empires, have formed to take control of the land and in turn dissolved over time to the point of seemingly leaving little chance of recovery, only an adaptation into something new. They've done at least a good job of not letting that happen so far, but they are far from leaving that sort of pattern in the rise and fall of empires anytime soon. A filter that they indeed are still in the process of moving through. So yes, they may be in the midst of passing through a great filter of their own, but at the very least at this moment, they are indeed surviving. If we really want to examine what could happen if a species reached, but failed to pass through a great filter of their own related to self-destruction, and in a manner that matches the sort of pattern that the human race has experienced time and time again, then it is finally time for us to look into the planet of Bryo and the Bryyo'mak, and see just how it all went wrong for them. We will now provide a summary of the events that took place on the planet Bryo with its native intelligent inhabitants, and explore their lore to give all that is needed to draw a full comparison to them and the possible fate of the human species of the real world. Bryo was a planet that was discovered by the Galactic Federation in the year 2068 in the Kalendor region's Federation solar system that exists on the very edge of Galactic Federation territory, and is known for its vast fuel geo resources and its involvement during the Phase-On crisis as a target for the space pirates and a Leviathan from Phase. In its current state, Bryo is a mostly uninhabitable wasteland stuck in tidal lock, with 48% of the planet scorched by its parent star forever, while another 48% of the planet is locked in an icy shadow, thus leaving only 4% of the planet that is actually habitable in the planet's equatorial region. It is here that the Bryyo'mak come into play. In ancient times, the Bryyo'mak, the original intelligent inhabitants of this planet, now known by the name of the Reptilicus in their devolved wild state, were an advanced race that emerged from their primal roots through a great schism that ended in a peaceful truce, and from there they sought to explore the stars and further the cause of advanced science wherever they went, developing into a race with the technology needed to craft vessels that they used to travel across the galaxy and the stars within it, meeting with other intelligent starfaring races like the Chozo, with which they shared both gifts of a physical nature and of an intellectual one, creating what came to be known as the Lords of Science. This class of powerful and intelligent Bryo natives were at the forefront of pushing the technology of their kind to the utmost, no matter what it took, And while it did provide the Bryyo'mak meetings with intelligent beings that might otherwise not been possible, at the same time they failed to heed grave warnings given to them by the Chozo regarding their own culture. You see, one of the major issues with the Lords of Science is that they focused only on the advancement of technology for the culture, and they seemingly ignored the primal traditions and societal values that had gotten them that far in the first place. They left the primals that sought to preserve these values and traditions out in the cold, making them increasingly angry and agitated and building tension between the two classes. The Chozo warned the Lords of Science that if they wished to reach the influence and prosperity that they themselves had reached, the Lords of Science and their followers needed to find a way to meld the ways of both them and the primals, to find a balance between nature and technology, and to cherish life on both sides of the aisle. But sadly, they did not listen, and in time, as tension continued to mount between the groups, a flashpoint event would send the fate of the Bryyo'mak into oblivion. On a day that honestly could have been like any other, a motion was made by one of the Lords of Science that would doom them and much of Bryo to the tides of war. Infuriated at the seeming lack of trust or appreciation, and the screams of those that could have been seen as mongrels by some, Suffice, the first Lord of Science, made a speech within the center of the royal city, and openly denounced the primals and the traditions of old. Though we may not know exactly what was said, it can be assumed that it was a damning statement, for it infuriated the worshippers of the old ways so much that there was no going back. Thus, the golden age of Bryo ended, and the age of schism began. The two sides were going to war. In the ensuing conflict, both sides would suffer immensely, and Bryo was made nearly into an uninhabitable wasteland entirely. The Lords of Science crafted terrible machines of war like the Morganar, and used them to tear apart communities and encampments with the primals in their lands, while the primals themselves assaulted their enemies with terrible curses, using whatever arcane magic they could to attack and destroy the Lords of Science and their weapons. We know that other civilizations made attempts to calm the two sides and find a peaceful solution, but they were rejected, the inhabitants of Bryo dead set on this terrible war. The Lords of Science especially did not seem to care much for the consequences of their actions, as their weapons would poison the water and air of the planet and cause so much disturbance that it rendered much of the world almost impossible to survive within. Only a small section of the planet remained capable of sustaining life, and it was there that both sides took their final battles to task. However, this is when the tides were turned severely against the Lords of Science in ways they could have scarcely ever fathomed. While they initially had the upper hand with their great war machines, in time, the rare resources they needed to actually fuel those machines would completely dry up, and without the weapons, the primal armies would overtake and kill them, one by one. The remaining handful of Lords of Science gathered together in a noxious swamp of sorts to have a final meeting, and it was agreed upon by all that they had made a terrible mistake in not heeding the warning cries of other races. With their planet dying and they themselves likely to face extinction, all they could do now was at least try to save their home if nothing else. And so, they took what remained of the technology and used it to create devices that would work to try and clean the air and waters of the planet. Though these machines did seem to work, the lights given off by them in the dark would attract the ire of the primals who, in creating new destructive dark magics, would assault and hunt down these last Lords of Science, killing them mercilessly as they were found. Eventually, there was only one Lord of Science left, the one responsible for providing much of the knowledge we have on the Bryyo'mak, and in fear of the fate of all, he took drastic action. He crafted Morganar that remain today out of stone, using his own acquired magic to animate them, and even learned how to use fuel gel as a power source in turn. With this, he would continue to try and purify the planet as much as he could and protect himself. And in his absence, the primals would totally lose themselves. With seemingly no more Lords of Science to hunt, they turned on each other. The traditions of old, the very ones they had fought for, would vanish as they devolved into a bestial mindset, a process that would be further exacerbated by the influence of Phazon during the Phazon crisis, and the true culture of their faction slowly evaporated and left only the reptilicus that are observed on Bryo today. Time would pass on for the last Lord of Science, and as he grew old, he knew that he would need a successor of some sort to continue his work. With the primals reduced to little more than instinctual beasts, and himself left with really no other options, he felt as if he had failed everything, even in these last moments of life. However, he lucked out one day, as he would randomly come across a young female primal, perhaps someone he could at least mold to his needs, But he had no need to do so, for it seems that she was actually looking for him. She was a prophetess of the primals, a rare specimen that somehow had retained her true intelligence, and she spoke to him of visions of a great cataclysm that was coming there in the future. A star-born terror that would destroy the world as they knew it if it could not be stopped. She knew that the rest of her clans could do nothing and would not listen to her, and so in desperation, she sought out the last Lord of Science to help her in her time of need. Throwing away any sense of skepticism aside, he would take note of this, and together, they would work to refit some of his machines in order to create a new weapon, one that could halt this oncoming threat and give Bryo the chance to rise again. But just when it seemed to both them that there could be a glimmer of hope for them and all of Bryo, an accident one day caused their entire supply of fuel gel to violently detonate. The explosion was so utterly massive that it caught the immediate attention of every primal tribe in the vicinity of the Lord of Science's hidden location. They'd been found out. With no fuel gel, he could not power his stone Mongonar for defense, and with little in the way of hope left, he gave the prophetess transcriptions of the true full history of the Bryyo'mak and sent her far, far away, asking her to write down and share the lore of the Bryyo'mak for any other to read and learn about. His only hope was that someone, anyone, would read those scattered fragments of the history and use them to understand the truth and find a way to save his people. Not just from the prophesied disaster, but from themselves, and to one day lift the veil of hate that had consumed the primals. This, the last Lord of Science spoke, before he was almost certainly attacked and killed, ending the age of the Bryyo'mak entirely. As anyone that's familiar with the lore of Bryo as it pertains to the events during and in the aftermath of the Phazon crisis knows, these last notes of pleading and desperation were unsuccessful. The disastrous force that the prophetess had seen in her visions was almost certainly the Leviathan that struck the planet during the crisis, and while it is true that the planet survived, and the Hunter was able to eventually cleanse the planet of its Phazon corruption and save it as much as possible, in the end, the fragments of lore scattered around Bryo and its main structures did little but provide the Hunter, and eventually the Galactic Federation, valuable intelligence on the history of the planet and why its native bioforms became so hostile. Though mutations from Phazon exposure had wrestled away what little cultural and high-order thinking that had been left in the primals, judging by their actions, it is uncertain if they could ever return to another golden age. Or at least it may be doubtful in the short term, and hopeful at best in the long term. And furthermore, though not explicitly stated or even known for sure, the fact that the last entry in the entire story of the Bryyo'mak was located in Bryo Ice strongly suggested the prophetess was pursued by the primals, just like the last Lord of Science, and left the final message in there. The war bands had been so aggressive that she was likely forced to escape to the frozen royal tombs on the side of Bryo, facing away from his parent star. A land so desolate in recent times that no living creature could have survived there for long. And thus, in scholarly reflection, it is likely that she died there. Not by the hands of another, but huddled, frozen like the royalty found in these lands, in an isolation so great that it would not surprise me if her body was never found. In likely death, though, she would have been in the presence of others that would have valued her services in life, and thus, if nothing else, would rest with the leaders that once epitomized the values of both the primal traditions and the Lords of Science, long ago in the golden age of Bryo. Now that we have covered the tale and fate of the Bryyo'mak, I think that it makes sense for us to be using them not only as an example of the idea of the Great Filter in action, but more importantly as a solid gauge in seeing how the human race stacks up against them and the pattern that seemed to befall them in their own time. Technology can give advanced races the power to destroy others and self-erase their entire kind, but the issue here is that the weapons that do the job often may be created for a purpose that they might not otherwise serve, or a different purpose altogether. In the case of the Bryyo'mak, their advanced technology was originally used to create spaceships and other objects that allow them to travel among the stars and make communion with other advanced, often hyper-intelligent alien races. Even objects that were meant for a role in combat to at least some degree, such as the gift of the screw attack from the Chozo, were treated with great ceremonial value and as a gift, and were never intentionally used as a weapon at the forefront. But when society collapsed and civil war erupted, these technologies were taken from their initial role as a tool for spreading peace and influence, and turned into tools to craft weapons of war from. Now it is true that you can make innovations in technology after making weapons, And a lot of parallels there can be drawn to the events of World War II in the real world as an example, since technology developed during the war, such as radio technology, would lead to the investment and development of more peaceful applications like microwave ovens. In saying this though, we can see a strong parallel between us and the Bryyo'mak, as the human race did just that as they did in their own world and time. Through war, they too devised and created weapons that, in their own way, instilled fear and led to terrible outcomes for their own kind. Think of it in a classic scenario like Europeans coming overseas to the early Americas and bringing with them traditional guns, things that didn't entirely exist in the way we would think among Native Americans at that time. Weapons that in some way outclassed what was available as far as technological advancement goes, and seeing how it could be devastating to those unprepared for them. It's no surprise to say then that the Bryyo'mak, in terms of the lore and the way they were encountered during the Phazon Crisis, are almost certainly meant to be a parallel to the real human race. Hell, with the Cuban Missile Crisis, they very nearly started a third world war that could have led to their end with the weapon capabilities of all at that time, and even more countries have come to develop and own those sorts of terrible weapons, making the thought of such a crisis in modern times an even more terrifying prospect. Truly, with the right chain of events, they could also destroy themselves, or at the very least, be placed in a situation where all the technology of the world would not be enough to quell the primal bestial instincts of mankind. However, what is the most striking aspect of this comparison to me and the rest of Science Team is simply the fact that this was not just a single event that led to a cascading decline into the current state of Bryo and its inhabitants. While much of the lore that was left by the Primal Priestess tells of the most recent decline of the Bryyo'mak into the Reptilicus, it's also rather apparent that this was not the first time it had happened. A torch on Bryo ice mentions that there was actually a great schism that happened a long time ago before the Golden Age even began, and that the royal tombs and structures that have been found there were built in honor of that schism ending. The ancient nature of this lost schism tells us that there is a pattern here. Even if it's a pattern that only had two current stages, given the way in which the decline of recent times happened, we think that it shows that even with the advancement of society and tech, the simple primal urges of the race as a whole were a focal point in both instances. The most modern, a battle of science and tradition, and the one before it, likely simpler, tribe against tribe, and we even see this repeated in the wake of the Age of Schism coming to a conclusion, as the primals started to fight amongst each other, unable to find peace again the same way they had in the past. And yet, just as with the human race, if time is all that is needed, then it is possible that society can be rebuilt. But that does not change the fact that the cycle clearly is still occurring for both humanity and the Bryyo'mak, making the purpose of this comparison clear in showing how they are so similar despite the past and technologies being so different. But if this is the case, and the Bryyo'mak and the history are meant to be a direct reference to the human race, and both the threat of destructive technology and the cyclical nature of civilization rising and falling, it could be postulated then that races like the Chozo are a success story that bucks the trend of the Great Filter, right? After all, while they too were known to have once been a proud warrior race that used their bodies and advanced technology to craft weapons of war, they did eventually come to a point where the technology could advance no further within the boundaries of physics. In response, though they did not completely throw away the ways of old, as tribes like the Makan have clearly demonstrated, the majority of them became peacekeepers, traveling across the cosmos in order to not just commune with other intelligent races, but to help nurture them to develop into peaceful races with which they could share the cosmos with. Talon 4 even shows this in the design of the Chozo settlements there, as they intertwine with nature to create a wonderful synergy, a union of the old of the natural world and the new of their advanced technology. Truly then, they must be the success story of how a race cannot just bypass the Great Filter, but also seemingly break free of this cycle of advancement and self-destruction, right? Right? Well, maybe not so much as you might think. See, this is the part where I'd like to make it clear that, even in the case of alien species that seemingly have passed through enough great filters that they have not just propagated their kind throughout the cosmos, but have also managed to do so in stages of both conquering others and then melding with others as peacekeepers, this does not guarantee that things will last forever, nor does it guarantee the cycle won't get to them at some point or another. Funnily enough, on the surface, the Chozo honestly are almost the prime example of how a single race can manage to become a solid fixture in the cosmos, enough that their bloody relics and ruins seem to be everywhere. However, if you also know the history of the Chozo, you also know that there is a bit of a smudge over this landscape. They're all gone. Well, at least as far as unknown information sources can tell. The Chozo broke through a lot to become so powerful and influential, and yet, it seems as if their time has passed. And sadly, this does come down to a few issues that are not only part of other possible solutions to the Fermi paradox, but also show that the survival of a great race can also be highly dependent on just what sort of other beings they encounter in their advancement and journey through the cosmos. First of all, there is the obvious issue of the dark force theory. In essence, this theory, as a possible solution to the Fermi paradox, states that the reason why you might not see or have any response from the potential intelligent life is because they are all keeping quiet to try and avoid being detected by intelligent races that may have been like the Chozo were originally, attacking and possibly destroying other races in order to conquer worlds for resources or some other potential gain. And if we really wish to talk about that all in this context, regrettably, there is only really one group that deserves the spotlight here: the space pirates. Now, it is true that the sudden decline of the Chozo in the known cosmos was not solely due to their presence, but the massive colony that once lived on Zebes definitely proved to be the nail in the coffin for them for some time. It was the colony the Galactic Federation and human race as a whole had the most exposure to, and the attack that essentially wiped out the native population on Zebes was entirely at the hands of the space pirates, who saw it as a prime prize and were able to overcome the Chozo with the help of Mother Brain, betraying her creators in the ultimate coup. Space pirates fit this theory perfectly because the entire purpose of the Confederacy was to attack and pilfer whatever objects and materials of value they could from other worlds and races, developing their technology and society for this sole purpose, and they were pretty damn effective at it, even over the course of the 100 doing their best to help exterminate their society. And on the latter note, when it comes to settling on worlds that prove to be too hostile for them to handle, the Chozo all fell victim to this issue not once, not twice, but 3 different times. Aside from Zebes, we know that the Chozo established colonies on Elysia, SR-388, Talon 4, and ZDR, and the latter 3 of them would end up wiped out by the presence of something else on the planets of choice here, though the last example wasn't really even supposed to happen. In the case of Talon 4, the Chozo that came to settle on that world came after they had spent their time creating Sky Town on Elysia and leaving the floating complex to the hands of the native Elysian machine race they had created to assist them in their research on the gaseous planet. On Talon 4, they settled down and sought to weave their life with nature rather than just simply building upon it. The remains of the Chozo ruins there more than show this, as what is still left there is a remarkable sight and more than demonstrates the extent of their colony on the planet. However, more than 50 years ago, the planet was struck by a Leviathan from Phase, and while they were able to create the crater over the impact crater in order to contain most of the Phazon, it was not perfect and was not set up right away, allowing the substantial volume of the material to inject itself into the crust of the planet, which the space pirates would eventually discover and build the Phazon mines in order to harvest. This toxic, radioactive, and semi-sentient substance would mutate the local populations and create terrifying monsters like Flagra that would poison the waters of their home, and even the Chozo themselves would be affected, the dead being resurrected as crazed, vengeful ghosts that could not tell friend from foe and would attack intruders on their territory with great vigor. After creating the cradle, the Chozo here had no choice but to flee their world, and while it is not known where the remains of that colony went, suffice to say, they have vanished entirely and are presumed to be gone forever by the majority of researchers that have studied the situation. Everything was going just fine, but the intrusion of a dark force was something that they simply did not understand and were not equipped to handle, a terrifying fate that even the Elysians knew of and were powerless to stop. When it came to planet SR-388 and planet ZDR, the reason for their virtual extinction came as a direct consequence of the presence of a hostile alien life form that the settlers of those colonies could have never predicted the existence of: the X-Parasite. There is a hell of a lot to say of these buggers, and just what sort of nightmare they were and could be to any world they were put on, but to quickly summarize why these entities were such a terrifying foe to go up against, they came in a wide variety of forms, shapes, and colors, depending on the type of creatures they occupied. They were virtually impossible to kill or harm, and their entire MO was to infect and copy the genetic material of a host, kill said host, and then use the stolen genetic material to transform to take on the forms and minds of the host they just killed, inhabited, or otherwise inhabited at some point. Moreover, they had the capacity to splice the genetic material of different creatures together to create new, monstrous and mutated forms that combine aspects of these different creatures to make more powerful and dangerous monsters. The Chozo were a race that believed that all natural life, no matter how dangerous or terrible it may have been, had a place to serve in the grand ecosystem of the universe, and thus should have been respected and not harmed if at all possible. But the idea of the X leaving any planet and spreading across worlds, killing all native life and replacing it with X-copied fakes, was a horror that the Chozo simply could not allow. It would defeat the purpose of life existing at all, as the only goal of the X-parasites was to reproduce and spread their kind across all possible ecosystems and worlds, the most primal of all basic instincts. And you know how the Chozo decided to deal with them? They broke their own rules and beliefs and created a bioweapon for the sole purpose of killing the X, the Metroid. And we all know how well that went well. Not well at all. And even then, they would eventually end up proving to be too much to control, and after Ravenbeak and the Mockin tribe decided to kill nearly every single member of the Thor tribe present there, they ended up taking an X-parasite back to the home base on ZDR, causing similar damage as seen on SR388, if not worse in some ways. These bastards were damn good at hiding in plain sight, and in the end, while they were seemingly wiped out by the Hunter, so too went the last of the Chozo, the end of the race as we know it. For now. The Chozo are not the only race of advanced beings that have suffered terrible fates from different sources, though. It's sort of a running theme in our neck of the multiverse, it seems. The Olympics were a powerful race of beings with advanced telepathic powers that only survived wars in the Tetra Galaxy by developing the most powerful weapons they could create. And while the war may have ended with them the victor, and with weapons so powerful that no other race dared to challenge them in their territory, eventually Goria came to them and proved to be so insurmountable that effectively forced the Olympics to use their own lives to seal and contain it, killing themselves in the process. The Luminoth, the once a peaceful race, were forced to go to war when the Ing attacked them, and their entire civilization was nearly wiped out, only saved in their most dire hour by the fortunate appearance of the Hunter. The Elysians, the sentient robots built by the Chozo, also suffered the same fate, as while a meeting with the Galactic Federation seemingly saved them from dying from lack of power and ushered in a new time of peace, the invasion of space-powered forces curtailed that and ultimately wiped out the only sane members of the race left. And even at the simplest level, the inhabitants of Byon and the Bermuda system were entirely destroyed by a cataclysmic volcanic eruption. One way or another, it seems that, with or without pattern, there is a cycle to the rise and fall of these civilizations, and in a much broader perspective than what the human race grapples with in their world. So now here we are, right back at the starting point, and seeing how seemingly anything can impose a barrier that can halt the development of an advanced intelligent life, or just intelligent life in general. And just because one is able to pass a barrier, it does not mean that something will potentially come into play that will create a new barrier a successful race may not have any useful guard against, and with the possibility of it all repeating one day in the future. So what exactly does this tell us about how the human race will fare in the future? How does this change the way they see not just themselves, but more importantly, how they cope with the apparent lack of life out in the cosmos? The irony of all of this compared to the others is that, like the Bryyo'mak, humans are definitely not immune to societal collapse in their history, but for a moment, I want us to take a step back, really look at humans, and sincerely both pat them on the back and issue an important statement to their place in the cosmos. Yeah, that might seem a bit presumptive in this context, but if you didn't think about it yet, they actually have managed to survive so far with something that could have proven to be of serious consequence and can be still. And that is that they're like the Bryyo'mak in one other key way. Remember when we mentioned that the Lords of Science have powerful weapons of war that they use against the primals that end up causing significant damage to their own world? When you really think about it, how exactly does that make any sense? What sort of weaponry could they have possibly had that could have caused that level of destruction? Well, we don't have an exact answer, but given the serious need for decontamination equipment, it was clearly something that had severe environmental effects to it, and was able to affect wide swaths of land, even compared to the thin band of land across Bryo that is even habitable to begin with. The exact answer might not be known, but we can still draw one final set of parallels here that I think should not just add one more layer to the connection humans symbolically have with this race, but also make it very clear just how close they are to the same potential devastation. human-made atomic weapons. At this point, those that know much about the many planets that have been explored in the travels of the Hunter know that nuclear power, let alone nuclear weapons, are rarely ever spoken of and have even less of an actual physical presence in weapon systems and the like. Now, why that is the case may be left up to interpretation, but I think the obvious answer perhaps is that such firepower is not only incredibly dangerous and powerful, given that the Alembic Omega Cannon essentially fires energy projectiles with the same radioactive nature and power as an actual atomic bomb, but also extremely toxic, with potential radiation and fallout being a primary consequence of the use of these weapons. Now, areas that are actively exposed to the effects of this radiation can become terrible for the health of present life forms, but in time everything can slowly recover. But if humans actually used every single nuclear weapon they have present on Earth currently at once, I think it would be safe to say that the combined damage would not just cause mass devastation, but could result in the radiation and likely poisoning of vast swaths of the natural environment. We know the sort of environmental damage this kind of event could cause, and given the comparatively tiny amount of land on Bryyo that could be habitable, if humans committed such an act on Bryyo, I have severe doubts that the Lords of Science could have developed anything at that time that could have halted the worst effects of this immediately. And in that capacity, humanity finds itself in a bit of a pickle. We do want to give praise to them that, outside of their initial creation and usage, they have not used these sorts of terrible weapons to end wars or their own kind and the like. They've had more than enough opportunities for that to change immediately, but they have managed to keep it in their hands and out of the air, safe and unused. They seemingly have done it, creating a powerful weapon and tool that could readily doom them at a moment's notice. But with that pat on the back given, there is still the notice of an important message to deliver from the cosmos and their own history on Earth. Don't get cocky, you're not out of the woods yet. Remember how we said that they are still passing through a great filter? These weapons represent that current filter more than anything else, and their species has shown cycles of development and destruction just the way that other races have. And in most instances, at some point or another, the cycles end up catching up to them, and it destroys them and everything they hold dear, with the only hope being left that the cycle will continue. It seems that every great civilization in some way or another meets this sort of end, and entire worlds of civilizations may be locked into these cycles almost perpetually. While the cycle's presence might be something that could discourage those looking for life elsewhere, knowing that for all the human race knows, they might be existing at a point in time where other intelligent races are in that downturn slump, and despite this bleak possibility, it offers hope to not only understand this cycle of civilizations rising and falling, but also hope that it can be broken. The only way that any race seems to have a chance to break their own cycle is to first understand it, and for the human race, that isn't exactly asking all that much. If anything, they already understand it to a degree, just maybe not in a way that they might be familiar with. The rise and fall of civilizations in their own history and lives is something that can be scaled up to see the inherent patterns in all of this, and this same pattern is what dictates how long a civilization will last. Whether they will make it far enough to see the stars above them, to reach out to them, and maybe one day actually travel to them. This cycle is what defines both cultural and technological advancement in all of its forms, and the only thing that might keep humanity from seeing it is the long nature of the cycle itself, for even more advanced races clearly have failed to see the cycle in their own history. Humanity has a huge advantage over a lot of these races though, and that is time. Yes, it is true they might not be able to see other civilizations in the universe just yet, but that is more of a boon for them than they think. The cycle can be broken by preparing for it. Disasters of the natural world might be a bit harder to predict, but to break the cycle, humanity must understand it for what it is, a cycle, and work to create a biological and cultural society that can withstand both internal and external forces that could cause it all to crumble again, only to potentially restart at some point. And the human race itself is actually quite young, and if there are no traces of alien life to them, that means they have time to prepare before a major threat does potentially come into view. Patience, time, and self-aware learning is all they need to break the cycle. If their world can come together and become a unified force that is ready for anything and able to flex with the universe to keep themselves alive in its direst straits, then they might just have the chance to beat all of us at it. In a lot of ways, the human race of the real world does seem to be alone, and beyond the scope of the universe, it may seem like there might not be anyone else out there. But if the races of our universe are anything to go by, that might not necessarily be a bad thing for them in the long run. If anything, what humanity isn't seeing, or even is seeing, to be fair, may just be a downturn and cyclical development in a race's evolution over time. This should not discourage them, but instead quite the opposite. It should be taken as a sign that they are the ones on the world stage now, and it is their time to shine and prove that they have the capacity to understand this cycle and possibly break it. It is a shame that the Primal Priestess was only able to share the lore of the Bryyo'mak as she and the last Lord of Science knew, but if they can go through the cycle and survive it more than once, then perhaps the human race can have that same luck, and in spite of the cycle, reach out to the stars, just as the Bryyo'mak once did. Thank you all for watching this video. We here at Space Pirate Science Team take our work very seriously, and we genuinely wish to be as informative as possible when it comes to the work we conduct here, for both ourselves and in the name of science. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and comment to help us get greater recognition out there to inform the greater populace of the universe as a whole. Also, feel free to keep track of us through Twitter, as we'll be posting notices there every time something new is submitted for your viewing pleasure. We hope to see you all in the next video, no matter what world it may take us to.